Okay. Before we get into Matthew 19 again this morning, let's talk about the three reasons, valid reasons for divorce in a legitimate marriage in the Old Testament. Now we understand that if there was an incestuous relationship, that could be broken off because it was never seen as having even begun. And if there was a case in which the father of a bride lied about her virginity or what have you, then that marriage could be dissolved because it's the contract, because marriage was a contract, quite literally, between the two families. And so that could be dissolved because the terms of the contract were never met to begin with, right? So it was based upon faulty, it was based upon a faulty understanding. So there were three. Besides that, though, there are three reasons that one could dissolve a legitimate marriage in the Old Testament, at least. Who can name those three reasons? Fornication, that's right. Okay, unbelievers. What did you say now? Okay, well that's one of them, but there was one more. Yeah, neglect. And so those come from Deuteronomy 24, 1-4. We're familiar with that one. We know about the unbelievers from Ezra 9 and 10. If you recall specifically in Ezra chapter 10, this is the most powerful of the passages. Here they say this in verse 3. Let us make a covenant with our God to put away all the wives and their children, according to the counsel of my Lord and of those who tremble at the commandment of our God, and let it be done according to the law. They were going to put away these women that were Gentile women, but they would do it according to the law. In other words, they would send them away with a divorce certificate so that those women could remarry if they so desired. So that's the second reason for divorce in the Old Testament. If there were unbelievers, if they were unequally yoked, as sometimes we like to say. But there's another reason why you might have divorce in the Old Testament. And this comes from Exodus 21, 10 and 11. So let's pay special attention to that one, especially this morning. Exodus chapter 21 and verse 10 and 11 says this. If he takes to himself another woman, he may not reduce her food, her clothing, or her conjugal rights. If he will not do these three things for her, then she shall go out for nothing without payment of money. In other words, she would not have to give the bride price back to the husband. That would often be used to keep her supported either while she looked for another husband, or while her father looked for another husband on her behalf, or if she needed to live alone for a spell. So Exodus 21, 10 through 11 provides another reason for the legitimate divorce in the Old Testament. That is, if a man reduces the food, the clothing, or the conjugal rights for his wife. Now, there's a way that we can go about this to make it a lot easier. Let me think up a good example, though. Let's say, for instance, that the speed limit is 45 miles an hour, all right? Now, if you go 55 miles an hour, you'll probably get a ticket, right? If the cop's feeling especially, like he needs to pull somebody over and he's got an easy way to turn around or whatever, you're going 10 miles over the speed limit, it's possible you're going to get a ticket. But what happens if you're going 30 miles over the speed limit? Yeah, you might get reckless driving or hazardous driving or whatever, right? I don't know all the rules because I've never been pulled over for for anything, but I just go the speed limit and don't worry about that sort of thing. Okay, so if you're going 10 miles over the speed limit, that's one thing. If you're going 30, though, okay, now we're talking a serious offense. So let's play that game here. Let's say that a man doesn't reduce his wife's food. He gives her all the clothes that she needs. He pays attention to her conjugal rights. But let's say that he beats the snot out of her every single night. Do you think that passage in Exodus 21, 10 through 11 allows for divorce in that case? Right. If this is not saying this is the only, these are the only things that a woman can go away for, But this is the base, very basic standard. If he's doing something that's way worse than one of these things, obviously the God that we serve, the God that sends rain and sunshine on the just and the unjust, wouldn't just allow for the woman to go away, but would want her to. Because why would the loving, infinite God demand that woman stay in that relationship? And also, if she were to leave it, why would he say that she could never ever remarry for any reason whatsoever, at all? This passage is not a absolute, this is the only reason. This passage serves as a very base reason as to why a woman under the Old Testament could leave her husband, and that's in cases of neglect. If he reduces her food, if he reduces her clothing, or if he reduces her conjugal rights. But if that's true for that, how much more would it be true if he was physically or emotionally abusing the woman? Okay. Now, as Jenny pointed out a couple weeks ago, he said, Daniel, this is Old Testament stuff. This isn't New Testament. So this doesn't necessarily apply to us anyways. And as I told him, he's exactly right. But when we look at Matthew chapter 19, the question is not, Jesus, what is your new teaching on marriage, divorce, and remarriage? The question is, Jesus, how do you interpret this according to the law? Is it lawful? According to the law of Moses, can a man divorce his wife for any reason at all? They're not asking Jesus to give his New Testament, New Covenant teaching. Keep in mind that Jesus said in Matthew chapter 5, 17 through 20, that if somebody takes away the least of these commandments or adds to these commandments, then his name would be taken out of the book of, or out of the kingdom, right? He would be called least in the kingdom of heaven in Matthew 5, 17 through 20. Jesus said he did not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill. And if you take away one of the least of these commandments, then you are least in the kingdom of heaven. And so they're not asking for Jesus' new covenant, brand new, teaching for the new age, new heavens and new earth. They're asking for Jesus' opinion on this divorce certificate in verse 3. Specifically, what they want to know is Jesus' opinion on a debate that was going on in the first century between two parties. Go back to Deuteronomy 24 for a moment, and then we'll get back to Matthew chapter 19. In Deuteronomy 24, we have here in verse 1, when a man takes a wife and marries her, and it happens that she finds no favor in his eyes, because he has found, and here's the expression, some indecency in her, and he writes a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out from his house. All right, so just that first verse there, the question is, what is indecency? For one of the groups in the first century, indecency meant anything at all. It didn't matter what the reason was. If a man was done with his wife, hey, just send her out. But that's not what Deuteronomy 24, 1-4 was trying to do. Deuteronomy 24, 1-4 was not to allow the men to divorce their women for just any reason. Deuteronomy 24, 1-4 was put in place to protect the woman in case her husband would send her away. She would have that certificate of divorce so that she could remarry. Deuteronomy 24, 1-4 was for the protection of the woman. So one group said that the indecency was just anything that he didn't like, anything that got him fed up, he could just send her out whenever. But the other group said, no. In Deuteronomy 24, 1-4, now notice what I'm saying. Specifically, in Deuteronomy 24, 1-4, we're not concerned with Exodus 21. We're not concerned with Ezra 9 and 10. In Deuteronomy 24, 1-4, indecency there is fornication. That is sexual immorality. If he finds indecency, that is sexual immorality in her, then he can write her certificate of divorce and send her away. In Matthew chapter 19, Jesus is not answering a question about every case, every possible reason for marriage, divorce, and remarriage. He's answering a specific question concerning this debate between these two parties about how he would personally interpret Deuteronomy 24, 1-4. So let's look at Jesus' response here in this passage, in Matthew 19. The first thing that Jesus says is this: have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female? And he said, for this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let no man separate. So Jesus' first point is, okay, you're trying to get out of marriage for any reason, but really that shouldn't even be, you shouldn't even be trying to get out of the marriage for any reason. You know, the original intention of marriage was for it to be a man and a woman forever. There was no original, exception clause. There was no way to get out of it. When you commit to a man and woman, when you commit marriage between man and woman, it's supposed to be for life, is what he says. Okay? So they asked the obvious question. They said, well, then why did Moses command, we noticed this last week, why did Moses command to give her a certificate of divorce and send her away? Now Jesus fixes their question. He says, because of your hardness of heart, Moses permitted you. So they said, some of the people in the first century believed that they had to give a certificate of divorce if their wife committed fornication or adultery, and if they found any fault in her, that they were commanded. But Jesus says, no, it's not commanded. It's he permitted it. Now notice why Jesus says he permitted them to divorce their wives. Not because of the hardness of the wife's heart, but because of the hardness of the man's heart. He says, because of your hardness of heart, Moses permitted you. In other words, because he knew that you would just send these women out anyways, he allowed you to give them a divorce certificate, and that's specifically for the protection of the woman. It's because of the hardness of hearts of the men during that time that he allowed them to send their wife away with a divorce certificate. This wasn't just to give them, I've heard people talk like this before. Well, if that's true, then that means people can just get divorced for any reason at all. And that's not what Jesus is saying. In fact, he's saying the opposite of that. He's saying you're wrong for sending them away for any reason. But Moses gave them this divorce certificate to protect the woman in the case that you have hardness of heart towards her. Now, again, he says there, but from the beginning it has not been this way. Now notice what he says in verse 9. And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for immorality, the Greek word there is porneia. You can probably see where we get some words for in our culture, from that word. And it means fornication. And now the reason why it's fornication here and not just adultery is because adultery refers to a specific action between a man and a woman outside of wedlock. Fornication, though, includes everything from two individuals of the same sex. It can refer to bestiality. It can refer to any number of sexual immoral acts that a man could commit and break his marriage contract in doing so. Ashley?
So in that context, it's only referring to a sexually immoral situation.
Yes.
Right? Okay. So where would you, or how would you? Because I've heard people say, if it was an abusive relationship, and the man
right.
won't change, that's how he's going to be. And I've heard older women tell these young women, you need to stay, you need to, and I'm like, no, I'm sorry, I can't do it. But they kind of go there like, well, he hasn't committed adultery, yeah, he about to death, but he didn't commit adultery, so you gotta stay with him.
Well, I'll get to that in just a second, all right? Because I want to go through a scenario with, we'll talk about it here in a moment. So, he says, whoever divorces his wife, that is, whoever sends his wife away, except for immorality, that is, sexual immorality, and marries another woman, commits adultery. Now, Jesus is not, the question in this passage is not, can a man send away, can a woman sue for divorce in the case that she's being abused by her husband? The woman divorcing the husband or suing for divorce is not in this passage in any way. This is specifically about a man sending away his wife, and they want to know, can we send them away for any reason? See, in the first century, these two schools of thought, they didn't care about Exodus 21. They weren't worried about that. Nobody questioned whether or not a woman could sue for divorce in case of neglect. These people, they're not worried about whether or not a man can divorce a Gentile wife that's causing him to fall away because she's an unbeliever and she refuses to proselytize and follow the one, the one true God of the Old and New Testament. That's not on the table in this discussion. They're not concerned with those passages. They're specifically asking Jesus, how do you interpret Deuteronomy 24, 1-4? Now, if Jesus is saying here that the only valid reason for divorce in any case, in all case, is sexual immorality, and he's supposedly answering according to the law, he would be contradicting Exodus 21, 10 and 11, and Ezra 9 and 10. So you see this? Because if Jesus is interpreting this lawfully, according to the law, right, he cannot be contradicting Exodus 21 and Ezra 10 and 11, or 9 and 10. Therefore, it's Exodus 21, 10 and 11, and Ezra 9 and 10. Therefore, Jesus is not answering what, all cases, marriage, divorce, and remarriage. He's specifically answering a question regarding Deuteronomy 24, 1-4. Okay? The people that had this debate about this passage, nobody thought that, nobody thought that a woman couldn't sue for divorce in a case of neglect. Nobody thought that a man or woman couldn't leave their husband in the case if it was a, Jew-Gentile marriage and there was problems there with, with struggling with unbelief. That wasn't the problem. The question specifically in Deuteronomy 24, rather in Matthew 19, is about Deuteronomy 24, 1-4. He's answering this question except for immorality in that specific case. Now let me show you another example of this in the New Testament, and then I want to give some examples that answer to what Ashley's saying. Look at Matthew chapter 12 and verse 38 and 39. All right? And notice how this passage is similar to Matthew 12, 38 and 39. How this passage is similar to Matthew 19. Some of the scribes and Pharisees said to him, "Teacher, we want to see a sign from you." But he answered and said to them, "An evil and adulterous generation craves for a sign, and yet no sign will be given to it, but," or you could say, "except the sign of Jonah the prophet." So he says, no sign will be given to this evil and adulterous generation except for the sign of the prophet Jonah. Now, there's a pretty quick, if you take that statement literally for all cases, for all time, what's the first major problem you run into? Yeah, if you just read the book of Matthew and you read before Matthew 12 and after Matthew 12, after Matthew 12, Jesus heals the 5,000. He casts out devils. Before Matthew 12, he had just healed somebody. He just did a sign. Jesus is not saying that this generation would not see any sign before or after this to prove Jesus as the Son of God. What he's saying is, in response to this question, this specific question, "Teacher, we want to see a sign from you," demanding to see a sign as a test, to test Jesus or whatever it might be, he's not going to give a sign in that regard. They're not going to be able to, they're not going to see any sign if that's their motive for wanting a sign. He's not answering this question or responding to them for an all cases for all time answer. He's giving this exception in this very specific question and answer scenario between Jesus and the scribes and the Pharisees. And the same thing is true about Matthew 19. Jesus is not giving a blanket answer for all cases for all time. If he was, he would be contradicting two major passages in the Old Testament. He's answering a specific case, a specific question about a specific passage, Deuteronomy 24, 1-4. All right? Anybody have?
Go ahead, Gary.
I think it's just important for us to keep in mind the context. Jesus is talking to Jews living under the
Right. Right.
So there's very little application here except for where it pertains to principle. If we want to know for us today, we can go to 1 Corinthians 7 and read what Paul has to say.
Yep, and that's what we're going to get to.
Sorry.
No, you're right. You're right. Well, that's where we're going in order. And that's been one of my main points, is that we've used this passage to talk about marriage, divorce, and remarriage in the New Testament. And it's about...
This is why there's so much difficulty in the church, because everybody wants to read this as if it's written to the first 21st century.
And Jesus is interpreting the law. But we're going to see that Paul says the same thing that the law does, but we'll get to that next week. Johnny?
No, you think Deuteronomy 24
Oh, sorry.
Not our stuff, but then you probably want to go back over it again now.
Okay.
Where you in immorality and uncleanliness?
Yes.
Saying that wasn't just something she did, because she didn't like the way she was cooking, she didn't like the way she dressed, or whatever.
Right.
That wasn't pertaining to that. That was pertaining to. Seemed like you said something.
Fornication.
You said that was pertaining to fornication.
Yes.
And fornication is what?
Well, that was the debate. Fornication is sexual immorality. Anything that a man does or a woman does that's sexually immoral outside of marriage.
Okay. But that was not. I always took that to be that anything that you wasn't pleased with, anything that you wasn't pleased with, immorality or whatever like that. See, but if that was under the law, which Deuteronomy was under the law gave the right that a woman did something like that, she's supposed to be taken out and stoned to death. Well, he wouldn't have to get no divorce.
Well, see, that's the problem. Is that sometime after Moses' death, we're not sure how long, but there's not many, if any, historical accounts of the death penalty being enacted for the children of Israel, regardless of whether or not that's right or wrong. And so divorce turned into a disciplinary action, almost as an action of mercy towards the woman. So I saw Zelda, but let Johnny reply first, and then
But then if you look at where
John 8.
Related to Jesus and told her, hey, this woman was called the very act.
Right.
So the law said, hey, you're supposed to take her out and stone her, So if they was referring to the law then, they still knew what it was, that hey, if she was called in this particular act, and you were doing time to the law, but then that woman was supposed to be stoned, it wouldn't have to take her out and give her a divorce. You understand what I'm saying?
Right, and then
So what you saying that meant immorality or uncleanliness,
right.
whatever, just meant that, then I don't see the purpose of the divorce. Why he give her the bill of divorce? Hey, no, you take out the stone to death.
To prove that she had committed sexual immorality, or for the divorce, for the death penalty, how many witnesses did you have to have? You had to have 2 witnesses, and so, or it says at the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, and so it would have been very hard to prove that, with 2 or 3 witnesses, anyways, because you'd have to have 2 or 3 people catch her in the act. And I don't think she's going to testify against herself, and the man's probably not going to do that either, because both of them would have to be put to death. And so one of the things that Jesus says in John chapter 8 is that, one, he says, ye who are without sin, cast the first stone. Because they had all done things, including not honoring their father and mother, as Jesus said in one place, that were all worthy of death. And so they were being totally inconsistent in their application, and that's what Jesus points out there in John 8. But the debate, the question that the Pharisees have is about this word indecency. And I think that Jesus is interpreting it as fornication. And one of the reasons why I think that is that the word indecency here, let me blow this up for you.
But then, back then, who was the one that determined what that word meant?
Who?
Immorality.
In which passage?
In that passage there.
In Matthew 19?
Who was the one that determined what was immorality? Who was the one that determined? Because you could take that one word.
Oh, well, the Greek word is actually, because when we think of immorality, we're thinking like anything that's not moral. The Greek word there is actually fornication, which is specifically sexual immorality. Which would be anything, Hebrews says that the bed is undefiled. So anything outside of marriage would be sexual immorality. To answer Johnny's question real quick, the word that's translated indecency in Deuteronomy 24 is the same word translated nudity or nakedness in other passages in the Old Testament, and that's one of the reasons why that's one of the reasons why I think that Jesus interprets it as fornication or as porneia. But that's why there was a debate, is because of the vagueness that the Hebrew language can have sometimes, and the many translations that that can be had for it. Jimmy, I think Jimmy had something real quick. Nope. Okay. Johnny?
And if that be the case, then why would Jesus specifically say, I said, not just for any cause, but I say except it be for fornication?
Because that's what they were saying. They were saying that word indecency means any cause. But there was another school of thought that said that word meant fornication. And so what Jesus is doing in Matthew 19 is weighing in on his side of the debate. But regardless of that, they're asking for Jesus' answer according to the law. If Jesus gave an answer that obviously violated what the law taught, then they had him. They had done exactly what they were trying to do right there. They had captured him. So regardless of how we interpret Deuteronomy 24 verse 1 or interpret Jesus' answer, our interpretation cannot be in contradiction with any part of the law, including Exodus 21 and Ezra 9 and 10. And so if we want to say that this word means any cause or what have you, we have to keep in mind that Jesus is answering in terms of the law, what is lawful. That's Jesus' standard. And so Jesus, as he said in Matthew 5, would not take away one jot or one tittle of the law until all was fulfilled, until all was accomplished. And so Jesus is still operating within the scope of the law of Moses in Matthew. If Jesus had contradicted the law, he would have done the very thing that the scribes and the Pharisees were seeking for him to do. Okay? Let me give a few examples real quick, and then we gotta have a quick meeting. So let's say that the only reason, let's take away Exodus 21, let's take away Ezra 9 and 10, let's take away 1 Corinthians 7. The only reason for divorce, the only valid reason for divorce is fornication. And if you divorce for any other reason other than fornication, then you can't remarry ever, ever, ever. All right? That means that a man could remarry, or fornication or death, right? That means that a man could remarry. All he has to do is, kill his wife, then he can go remarry, right? Because it's fornication or death, so now he can remarry. Yeah, right? Because that looses her from the bond. Okay? But, obviously that's sort of a silly example, but it shows the problem with, the situation. But if a woman's being beat, half to death every night, then she just has to stay in the relationship because it says except for fornication. But does that reflect the character of God? And I think that's where one of the discussions has to go, or has to come from. Let's look at Matthew chapter. Let's see, Matthew chapter. I always get the wrong one. It's not Matthew 15. It's Matthew. It's Matthew 12. Matthew 12, verse 1 through 4. 1 through 7. Let's read the whole thing. At that time, Jesus went to the grain fields on the Sabbath, and his disciples became hungry and began to pick the heads of grain and eat. When the Pharisees saw it, they said to him, "Look, your disciples do what is not lawful to do on a Sabbath." He said to them, "Have you not read what David did when he became hungry, he and his companions? How he entered the house of God, and they ate the consecrated bread, which was not lawful for him to eat, nor for those with him, but for the priests alone. Or have you not read in the law that on the Sabbath the priests in the temple break the Sabbath and are innocent? But I say to you that something greater than the temple is here. But if you had known what this means, I desire compassion and not a sacrifice, you would not have condemned the innocent." Let's apply this to Matthew 19, this logic to Matthew 19, or this wisdom to Matthew 19. In Matthew 19, Jesus says, except it be for fornication. But Jesus is not dealing with a marriage there that the man is mistreating his wife or beating his wife or whatever. He's, in the example given, he's dealing with a, with a normal marriage on all other accounts. Okay. This passage in Matthew chapter 12 teaches us that we have to use wisdom when interpreting any kind of law. And this phrase here, he says, if you had known what this means, I desire compassion, not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the innocent, I think allows us to use wisdom in dealing with a situation where a man is abusing his wife or a wife is abusing the husband. The person who said this, Jesus, in Matthew 12:7, would also be the same person that would say, okay, your husband is beating you. Why would why would I want you to stay with that man? Why would I not want you to go and find somebody that's loving and caring and is actually going to take care of you and support you, right? This Matthew 12:7 gives us a different way to look at the law. He says, okay, technically, David was wrong. He was unscriptural. He was unlawful when he ate the showbread. But that's not what the purpose of that law was for, and so he was innocent when he did it. Technically, the priests break the Sabbath. But that's not what the law was given for. That's not the purpose of the intent of the law. And so it's okay when they do that. They're innocent when they do that. Yes, it's technically wrong to pick grain on the Sabbath. But my disciples had no grain. They're starving, so it's okay for them to do that. Yes, Jesus says in Matthew 19, except it be for fornication. But obviously, if there's a situation where a man is neglecting his wife or abusing his wife, he's not going to force her to remain in that marriage. And of course, we know that from other passages that wouldn't be a problem anyways. So the point is we have to use wisdom when we're dealing with the law. And a lot of the times we reverse what Jesus said. Jesus said, my yoke is easy, my burden is light. And we've made his burden a lot more difficult to bear than even what they had under the law. We kind of go the opposite way with that. All right. So there's a couple of thoughts there from Matthew chapter 19 and the exception clause, as it's often called. And that passage, that would be the same. The same would be true for Matthew chapter 5 as well. What I want to do next time we get together is look at Paul's teaching, as Gary pointed out in 1 Corinthians 7, because Paul's teaching in 1 Corinthians 7 is really interesting. And one of the things that he says is, if you are married, do not seek to be loose, and if you're not married, don't seek to be married. And he's talking about a specific time and situation of persecution there. But one of the things that he mentioned in a previous passage was, he said that some of those at the church at Corinth were adulterers and adulteresses. And we're going to see how all that fits together, the next time we get a chance. But so read over 1 Corinthians 7 and study that, and you might even read 1 Corinthians 6 as well to get that part about them being adulterers and adulteresses and all the other types of sin and things that they're committing. But one of the things that we want to talk about is how do you repent? So how do you repent? How do you repent of stealing something from somebody? If I steal, if I go and I steal $5 from you, how do I repent? Okay, right. You try to pay it if you can. It might be a situation where you can't pay it, whatever. But there's obviously a change in heart, which results in a change in action. Okay, how do you repent if you murder somebody? Well, you can't bring them back to life, can you? So how do you repent?
Well, you don't continue murdering people. That'd be a start.
Right, and you probably do everything you could to preserve life if there was an option to do that. Okay, so we're going to talk about how do you repent in the case of committing adultery or divorcing someone for the wrong cause. And by that I mean for any reason at all, because that's what Jesus condemns, is divorcing for just any reason at all. Now, fornication, neglect, and as Paul's going to point out in 1 Corinthians 7, a situation where you're unequally yoked with an unbeliever, those are valid reasons for divorce. But let's say she burned the cooking and you just divorce her. How do you repent of that? Do you force her to come back into the marriage to repent, or what do you do? So we're going to talk about that when we get to Paul's teaching next week. But let's go ahead and stop there. And